You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. Joined by my co-host, the Batman to my Robin, the Robin to my Batman, whichever way you want to slice it. Ciaran O'Connor, how you doing today, buddy?
I'm good, man. I'm jealous that you guys are in LA. It's like 30 degrees in New York right now.
Oh, man. Well, I feel for you, brother. I feel for you. But likewise, I'm very pleased to be joined by author, journalist, the one and only Bari Weiss. Bari, how you doing?
I'm in LA. How can I complain? It's like 7 degrees out. Sorry, Ciaran.
Yeah,
I'm really happy to be with both of you.
I lived in LA for 2 years with John, and then I came back to New York, and sometimes I regret my decision.
We had a lot of good times in LA. Ciaran, you got to come back out here and hang out with Bari and me sometime if we can ever get a group together. So all sorts of things to talk about, folks. One thing I'll say really quick is that the good weather in LA never kept anybody in LA from complaining, but there are bigger things to be complained about and discussed in the world of politics, media, polarization, journalism. We've got an excellent guide here to help us do it. But before we get into the wider issues of polarization and some of the other things, I want to know, and I want folks listening to this podcast to know a little bit about the story behind Bari Weiss. Bari is somebody who obviously has impacted the conversation in America over media culture in a profound way, but we want to learn more about you. Bari, where does your story begin?
Well, it depends how far back you want to go, with my great grandparents moving to this country or whatever. But I was born in Pittsburgh. And shout out to all Pittsburgh listeners. Maybe Nellie and I will end up there someday. It's a really, really wonderful place to have grown up. I'm the oldest of 4 daughters. My youngest sister is 12 years younger than me, so there's a pretty big spread. And I grew up the daughter, and this is probably relevant given the work that you guys do, the daughter of a politically mixed marriage. My mom, a liberal, my dad, a conservative, became a conservative in college, I should say, entered college as a Maoist, and then became kind of the black sheep politically of his own family. And so they've always canceled out each other's votes. My dad, I'm not revealing anything here because he is shameless and wrote about it himself. My mother withheld sex in 2016 and then again in 2020 to make sure that he would not vote for Donald Trump. And I think he wrote in Steph Curry in 2016 and maybe Nikki Haley this time around. So
that's a very effective strategy for political persuasion.
It's a modern Liz Estrada situation. So it worked, I will say. And, that was 2016, especially, was a really interesting time to be in my family. We got those shirts that were like that meme. I don't know if you guys remember it. That was like pussy grabs back or something. And everyone was marching around my dad wearing it for about a month. So that's my family. Suffice it to say, we're a family where we're very, very comfortable talking about politics and do that all the time. And I have to say, and I feel really grateful for this, really love each other, even when we disagree. Most of those conversations, and this is, I would say the moving force of my life is Judaism. And in most of those conversations that I'm describing in those debates would take place in my family around the Shabbat dinner table. So every Friday night, that was sort of not to be missed event in my family. We missed a lot of school dances, which we were a little bit bitter about in high school. But in retrospect, I think it was a really good value and one that I still continue now, which is the ritual of sitting and talking with no phones. And now I've become much more observant where I don't really touch my phone for 25 hours of Shabbat, and sort of get offline and connect with people in IRL, I guess, in a real way. So that's the broad context that I grew up in. Just to connect it to journalism.
Yeah. How does your upbringing sort of, how does it frame and influence your work and what you actually do?
Well, I will say that there are a lot of writers that I meet who dreamed about being a writer from a really young age, kept diaries, imagined themselves writing novels. I was not that creative, meaning like I was not one of those people that imagined that for myself.
Mm.
I was like, I'll be a lawyer. I like arguing. And I, like getting kind of into it with people.
My Jewish friends sometimes tell me that that is a part of Jewish culture itself.
Yeah, well, certainly, like, the second most important, I would say, work in Judaism, other than the Hebrew Bible, is the Talmud, which is really just a compendium or a record of famous rabbinic sages arguing through the ages on the same page.
Mm.
And not to get too Jewish too quickly on here, but I actually think this is something that I talk about sometimes. I think is super relevant to what you guys do, which is in Judaism, there were kind of two famous competing rabbis in a particular time, Rabbi Hillel and Shammai. You've probably heard of Hillel because he is famous. All of these, organizations are named after him. And Shammai is the one that is lesser known. And the question is, why was Hillel the one that was remembered? Why was he privileged ultimately over Shammai? And the answer that the rabbis give is because the school of Hillel taught the arguments of the school of Shammai first. In other words, we put a really big premium, I would say, let's say Judaism at its best, are the better angels of Judaism, on hearing arguments that we disagree with and giving them their most generous read. So we are an arguing people, and we think that that can be a source of strength. So, in retrospect, when I look back on my life, the fact that I wound up in a career that kind of monetizes argumentation and articulating my worldview and trying honestly to convince other people about it, it's not a surprise. It's just not what I thought I would end up doing.
So not a coincidence then. Your Jewish heritage is clearly, I think, a big part of what has set you on the course that you've found yourself on. And you said that you are from Pittsburgh originally. That was the location of the Tree of Life synagogue, which obviously was the stage for one of the most heinous hate crimes in American history. Where were you in proximity to that event, and how did that impact you, being a person who is from the community and obviously Jewish yourself? Did that influence your outlook on the country and the work that you do in any way?
Yes. And if we had many hours, I could tell you all of the ways. I'll say that Squirrel Hill, which is where Tree of Life is located, and I grew up really, with down the street. Mr. Rogers' own actual house is directly down the street from Tree of Life. It's the synagogue where I became a bat mitzvah in 1997, which is like 100 years ago, not to age myself. And the Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh is very much like a kind of 21st century shtetl, which is an Eastern European village. And what I mean by that is that unlike a city, John, like LA, or Ciaran, like New York, where the Jewish community is huge and you can kind of remain in your bubble, whether it's reform or leftist or anti-Zionist or Zionist or conservative or Orthodox or whatever, Pittsburgh was small enough that we all know each other. And so that morning of the shooting on October 28th, I was not in Pittsburgh. I was in Arizona for a conference, a Jewish conference. And a text came through in my family WhatsApp group from my youngest sister that said, there's a shooter at Tree of Life. And my thought immediately went to my dad, because he's kind of he's an unusual person, as you've already learned. And he's kind of a promiscuous Jew. Like, he likes to float around and goes to different services depending on the day. And as people maybe know, there were 3 different kind of communities that met in the Tree of Life building. And my mom wrote back, that thank God he wasn't there. But she said, of course we'll know people who are there. And my family knew something like 6 of the 11 people that were murdered. And I was supposed to fly, of all places, to Israel that Monday. to do a reporting trip, but I ended up flying back home, of course, because there was nowhere else that I could be. And I mean, you guys know this, like, to be an American in the 21st century is to kind of become sadly immune or numb to mass violence. And, we hear like El Paso and you vaguely remember like Walmart, a guy that hated immigrants, but you don't remember the people that were murdered. Or you think of Las Vegas, or it's like the list of place names of places that are kind of synonymous with mass shootings is long enough that you can't even remember all of them. And it's really horrible and an indictment of the country in a lot of ways. I will simply say that as much as you can, there is a difference between reading about something and seeing it. And the change that the impact that it had on me, to see, I remember there were a few things that will never leave me, but one of them was being in the synagogue, and the FBI agent who was in charge of the kind of cleanup and crime scene, not the cleanup, the crime scene, sobbing and falling into the arms of a rabbi that is beloved in the community, who was overseeing the sort of ritual cleanup of body parts that were left, and making sure that they were being buried by Jewish law and not being disposed of. Like, there were so many things that I could talk about. And I don't want to get too emotional. The thing that is relevant, I would say, most relevant to our conversation today, is that I grew up with kind of two religions, if you could say that. One was Judaism and the other was Americanism. I mean that not to say that it was like jingoistic or blindly patriotic, but I was really raised with kind of an unshakable faith that America was exceptional, that America was obviously imperfect, but that it was a union that was always being perfected, and that any like anti-Semitism or bigotry that I experienced, and of course I did, I remember waiting for the school bus to take me to my Jewish day school with one of my sisters, and a Catholic school bus driving by and calling us kikes and dirty Jews, and things like that happened. But the reason that they never impacted me and they kind of rolled off my back is that I saw them as kind of embarrassing and like a vestige of an uglier time. And I saw myself as having, a total right to claim that I was a full American, and that, that America was a kind of nation of immigrants, and America had allowed me to be a full Jew and fully American, and that there was no contradiction between those two things. And that, the ideals that the founders, for all of their own flaws and hypocrisies, established, were becoming ever more true. And I think that day, and then sort of the weeks and months that followed, and then 6 months later to the day, the shooting at the synagogue in Poway, and by another white supremacist, and then, the machete attack in Muncie, New York, or the attack on the New Jersey kosher supermarket, and then the kind of rolling waves of attacks that have been taking place in Brooklyn, shook my faith in that. And it didn't shake my faith in what America can be, but it made me realize that those things are fragile. They're very, very fragile. And the more that we undermine and move away from ideas like, equality under the law, the dignity of the individual, the notion that we're all created in the image of God, to various forms of kind of tribalism and polarization and a politics of group identity in lots of different ways, the more dangerous the country will become, inevitably, not just for Jews, but for anyone that is sort of different from the majority. And so that, I would say that there was a kind of loss of my faith in that, and a sort of deep passion that was ignited in me for the need, I would say, to fight for those ideals that have made this country such an exceptional diaspora experience in all of Jewish history, and a real desire to fight anyone that wants to kind of pull us back into the mean of history.
I want to ask a little bit about your career. You clearly have a gift for communicating. Did you always know that you wanted to be a writer?
No, I would say that I was kind of an activist and really cared about various issues. And I realized when I was a student at Columbia that, and this was true in my own life, like and maybe I wonder if it's true for you guys, when I think about the things that have really shaped me, to some extent, that's been participating in protests and march and such. But a lot of the things that have really shaped my worldview are in a handful of books and essays that I've read. And I realized that for me, that was just such an effective way to communicate ideas, that I would rather try and move someone in 800 words in the student newspaper rather than like making a poster board and standing in the quad. And so that's really where it began for me. It's not that I think I'm any great shakes as a writer. It's that I feel like that was, or at least as it began, that was the most effective way for me to communicate my values and my ideas. And as I've grown as a writer, the pleasure in kind of developing my own voice and my own style has been amazing. But I don't ever think I'll be as talented a writer as, Nellie, my fiance, who's just like an incredible stylist. But I can aspire to something.
So fast forward a little bit, as your career as a journalist progresses, you get hired by the New York Times in 2016. I think a lot of people know you best as a now former New York Times columnist.
That's going on my tombstone. It's Bari Weiss, formerly of the New York Times.
Right. Yeah, it's like the artist formerly known as Prince.
Yes, totally.
Well, first off, why did the New York Times hire you?
Okay, so the New York Times, I would definitely say that I was a diversity hire in terms of ideological diversity. So I had been at the Wall Street Journal for many years, both as an op-ed editor, then as a book review editor, but all under the auspices of the editorial page, which for people that don't know it, or maybe the red side of that logo knows it, is the foremost conservative, maybe the only conservative editorial page in the country. And I was always kind of the leftmost flank by a lot inside that institution. I was the squish, as I was affectionately called. And I really enjoyed working there. But that was kind of my position. Following the election of Donald Trump, there was a tremendous amount of soul searching that happened inside lots of media institutions, but I would say especially the New York Times. Because if you remember the infamous needle that told us that there was a 99.9% chance that Hillary Clinton would win, and everyone basically in the legacy media thought the same. And so it was a kind of real egg on the face moment when Trump pulled it out. And there was a sense of like, how did we miss this? Like, our job is to cover the country. Our job is to mirror the country and the world back to our readers. How could we do better by them? And so there were editorial decisions that were made on the news side in terms of like undercovered things that we need to cover more. And then on the editorial page side, I was hired, and so was my, longtime colleague at the Wall Street Journal, Bret Stephens. And his job obviously was to do what he's done for a long time, which is to write his column. And my job, and I don't know if listeners will know this because they probably know me through my own columns, but that wasn't my primary job. My primary job was to be an editor. It was to commission pieces by writers who would not otherwise think of the New York Times as their natural home. Conservatives, heterodox, I don't even know what that means anymore, but people that don't, libertarians, people that don't fit into a political tribe, but also like first-time writers, dissidents in places like Hong Kong and the Middle East. And I love doing that work. Like, that is for me the greatest like, that's when I get flow, is thinking about those voices, finding unusual people to make arguments, and then working with those people. So that's what I was brought in to do. And as I wrote in my resignation letter, I was never like, there were a lot of people that weren't on board, I would say, with that effort. And so from the moment that I walked into the New York Times, like, I was not going to be invited to be at the cool kids table. There were certain colleagues that just really were quite icy to me, like some people who didn't really speak to me. I know this sounds crazy, but that's what it was. And again, like, it kind of didn't rate for me, only like, meaning I've been used to being kind of the odd man out, and putting up with, not being so accepted for me was a totally worthwhile price, because holy crap, like, I get to work for the biggest platform in the world. And not only do I get to, amplify at a scale that I never thought would be possible, my own writing, I get to do that for other people. And I would say that kind of delicate balance really shifted throughout the Trump presidency. And I should shut up and let you ask another question.
Well, it sounds like a return to high school a little bit. You can compare your high school experiences and your experience at the New York Times for us sometimes. Now, I have a quote from you here as saying that the truth is that intellectual curiosity, let alone risk-taking, is now a liability at the Times. So you had a negative experience. Clearly, like you said, you weren't brought into the kind of, inner circle of the publication. I guess my question is this an issue with the Times specifically? Is this an issue with sort of journalism as an institution, I guess, in American life? I mean, how much is your experience at the Times indicative of some broader phenomenon in the media for which people should be concerned?
The answer is extremely indicative. And I think there's been now dozens of examples to show it. I want to just draw a connection, though, for listeners between my treatment, which was very shoddy, and the quote you just read, which is that intellectual curiosity is a liability. As what political scientists call the Overton window, sort of the spectrum of acceptable discourse, narrowed radically, what that meant is that anyone that fell outside of that Overton window on any number of topics. So let's just take the topic of, the real tension between transgender inclusivity and women's sports, just as one example. That was a topic where if you didn't fall on the right side of it, you were not considered someone who just disagreed. You were considered someone who was bigoted or bad. And I can choose a dozen topics like that. And so there is a really, really clear correlation between an atmosphere of kind of forced ideological homogenization and the treatment of people who don't fall in line with every aspect of the institutional orthodoxy. And so in that context, even though there were certain topics where I'm like definitely in line with, I would say, where a lot of progressives are, there were a number of topics where I wasn't. And so almost like in a religious environment, I was treated as kind of a heretic. And I was certainly not unique in that. And I think, having a chilled atmosphere when it comes in a newspaper or a university is extremely dangerous, because our job is to be intellectually curious. Our job is to tell people the truth, even when it's inconvenient. And when you have a survey like the one that came out, I think a week ago from Inside the Times, where 51% of New York Times staffers say they don't feel comfortable expressing their true opinions, or it was something along those lines, like, that's crazy. This is a newspaper, that level of sort of chilled environment when it comes to liberty of thought and of speech is really, really troubling, because how can you trust an institution to tell you the truth if the people that work inside of that institution are telling you, I'm scared to tell the truth?
How much of that do you think was driven specifically by the election of Donald Trump? Because I've heard a lot of folks on the left use terms like, the emergency president or the 5-alarm president. We have to treat every day like an emergency. You know, this is not just a normal Republican or not even a normal populist. This is an existential threat to our democracy and our safety. So obviously Trump was an accelerant, and I think a lot of folks argue these trends were already happening. But how important was that? You know, if Hillary Clinton had won in 2016, do you think things would have gone very differently?
That is the million-dollar question. I don't know. Look, I think it's two things at once. It's the ideological accelerationism that you're talking about, Ciaran, that's totally true. And it's also, and I don't mean this to sound cynical, it's just very, very real, and I felt it myself, it's smart business. What the New York Times is selling, as Martin Gurri and other people that are way smarter than me is pointing out, is to some extent outrage for their readers. And obviously we could say the same thing about Fox. Here's what I mean by that. The New York Times readership is 95% liberal or Democrat. When they are and we know from the algorithms inside Facebook and the rest that outrage engages people and outrage sells. And, you know, that brought incredible, like if you go look at the New York Times stock price, like that was a strategy that really, really, really worked. Now, that just because it worked as a business strategy for a particular news organization does not mean that it's good for liberal democracy or the country. But it's abundantly clear to me that that is the strategy. And so I think what we're going to see in the next year or two is, in the absence of that, you know, the bad orange man, the boogeyman, whatever we want to call it, like the object of everyone's loathing, is something. Is the Times and everyone else inside that world going to have to find a replacement? Will there be a replacement? Is the, you know, I've probably seen like 10 different specials on cable news about QAnon. Like, is QAnon really the thing that is most urgent in the country right now? Or is it the fact that we're in an endless pandemic where 1 in 5 small businesses are not going to make it through this, where children all over the country have not, you know, been able to get back to schools? Like, those to me seem like more urgent stories, but I'm not sure that those stories sell in the same way. And so I think it's just very important in conversations about like what drives media. Like a lot of conservatives that I know kind of imagine like a cabal inside the New York Times that's sitting together and being like, you know, how do we push our ideas into the public? How do we, you know, get people on our side, et cetera, whatever the thing is? It's more subtle it's more like basic than that. It's what do our readers click on? And I'll tell you as an editor that like, I knew, like, you know, as an editor, what's going to shoot to the top, you know, and you get to know very, very quickly the impulses and the tastes of your readership. And it's very hard as an editor or a columnist to resist that, because of course you want to be widely read. Of course you want to be in the top 10 most popular of the month and called out by your editors in the staff-wide meeting for having that piece. And so it takes a tremendous amount of discipline and restraint to say, okay, I could write like another op-ed about how Donald Trump is horrible, or I could expose my readers to this overlooked, undercovered story that is actually extremely important and will say something new, if that makes sense.
Ironically, I bet your columns were also very well read, even if they were hate clicks for a lot of people. Is that true?
Depends on the column. You know, there were certain columns that I worked so hard on that I'm so proud of still, that didn't get huge readership, but I'm thrilled that I did them. And then, of course, there were columns, and this was the interesting shift from going to the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times. I'm sure that if I looked back to pieces I wrote for the Journal, although I have a terrible memory, that I wrote, you know, a piece similar to one that I wrote early on in my tenure at the Times, which was called 3 Cheers for Cultural Appropriation. Like, I've definitely written columns like that in the past.
Spicy title.
Right. So it's just like, in the context of the Journal, like the readers are like, oh yeah, of course. Like, of course. But in the context of the Times, and this is going to make me sound naive, but like the response to that early column was shocking to me. Like, I was like, oh, wow, like I am dealing with just a totally different set of readers. Yeah. But so like, I think that's also important to understand. So it's like if readers at the Times are expecting kind of like a warm bath of things they already agree on, and then you put something that they disagree with, yeah, they're also going to click. And again, like, I would say that if there's a knock against me, although I'm sure there are many, one of them is that I've become the kind of go-to person for like the cancellation stories or the cancel culture stories. And like, you can become, as a writer, sort of one note. And the tension for me is I don't want to become one note and only write about that. There's a million things I'm interested in. On the other hand, you look out into the world and you're like, but hold on, if I don't write that story, is anyone else going to write it? Because it's like on a topic, let's say, that, gets ignored by the legacy press. And so that's a real tension that I feel in my work right now.
Do you draw a straight line connecting the chilling effect that you described in the, in the editorial room, in the workspace of the New York Times, where some folks don't feel comfortable expressing positions that they know are going to be outside of the mainstream, to the chilling effect that surveys have shown is very much a reality in the American population, broadly speaking? Most Americans, it seems, particularly as you go further towards the center and the right, but most Americans do not feel comfortable expressing everything that they believe politically. So is there a direct relationship as you see it?
Yes, but I don't think this is necessarily the fault of the New York Times. I think they're both, everyone's enduring, everyone is living through what I think will be remembered, at least, I'm not talking about all of America, but let's say like in Blue America and inside key sense-making institutions, we're living through an ideological revolution. And that revolution has been sped up in huge ways, or maybe actually has been created by, who knows, historians will be able to tell us, by the internet. Which is to say, if we're now living in a world in which everything that we do is recorded forever, for all time, there's no such thing as in like, old Westerns of making a bad reputation in one town and moving to another one and changing your name. Like, you can't do that anymore.
Definitely not.
Because you have a cloud of shit that follows you everywhere you go. And so, I wrote about it in this recent column as a kind of like crowdsourced McCarthyism. And it's not that is going to come for everyone. It's not going to come for most people. It's just that you only need a certain number of high profile shamings or cancellations or whatever we want to call them, people losing their jobs for silly mistakes or for one bad judgment call, to create a chilling effect on everyone else. If you see that famous person couldn't even endure it, like, why would you risk your job, your reputation, your, security for your children? No, you're just going to shut the hell up. And that's what I think we're seeing throughout the culture. And there's an amazing essay, I don't know if you guys do show notes, but that I would really, really recommend to your readers. The famous Soviet Jewish dissident, Natan Sharansky. If people have not read his book, Fear No Evil, they should read it. It's like classic memoir of his time in the Gulag, spent 10 years in the Soviet Gulag system, and now for the crime of wanting to move to Israel. Ultimately, he is in Israel, he lives in Jerusalem, and he wrote an excellent essay recently about how troubled he is to see some of the phenomenon that he thought were phenomenon of totalitarian countries, like doublethink, existing in American institutions. And I can tell you for a fact that is true. The gap between what people will say to me privately and the things they will tweet out publicly cannot be overstated. Cannot be overstated. And when I hear from high school students, at some of the most elite prep schools in the country saying to me, oh yeah, I lie all of the time in my papers. I parrot what I think my teacher wants to hear, because why would I risk getting a bad grade and not being able to get into Yale or Harvard? Like, that is crazy. And that is 100% where we are. And it is not the New York Times is one tiny data point in that much bigger story.
Well, what you're saying definitely sounds concerning, but I'm cognizant of the fact that what you're describing as sort of crowdsourcing McCarthyism is something that would be described by other people as simply the sort of sort of social censure that doesn't represent an abridgment of the First Amendment because it's not coming from the government. It's coming from the consensus of our peers and other people in society who feel that certain points of view shouldn't be tolerated and may be threatening. And it reminds me of something that, in the context of the Times, just to linger on it for a second, it reminds me of something that, Ciaran, you were talking to Matt Taibbi about a little bit, which is the fact that if you rewind the clock a little, I think that the way you said it was that, the Times editorial board and the folks who basically ran the journalistic establishment in America were more or less sort of like, 50 white men in Manhattan. And right now, I think what we're observing in so much of American society is new and diverse voices sort of achieving positions of influence in institutions who are seeking to highlight systemic problems and other issues that they feel are underreported on in American life. And I guess within that context, there seems to be friction and conflict because there seems to be this sense that certain viewpoints are striking against the well-being of marginalized people in America. And there's resistance, obviously, at the elite level of society and in, just out on campus and in various walks of American life. So I guess the question here is, do you think that given this surge of diversity in America's elite institutions and so forth, that there is any way to avoid this sort of conflict, or is it just sort of the price that we pay for the balance of power shifting in society?
I would say that it's more like a generational conflict. Mm. I think it's that if you went to college, so let me step back a second. Mm. The old consensus view between liberals and conservatives was, oh my God, campus craziness, but it goes away as people move out into the world, right? So the Oberlin famous story about the culturally insensitive Japanese food or whatever, that's just silly campus politics. As the Oberlin gender studies major makes her way into the world and gets a job at McKinsey, she'll leave all that nonsense behind and become an institutional person. Mm-hmm. That is just simply not what has happened. And the best article about this, of course, is Andrew Sullivan's We All Live on Campus Now. It turns out ideas matter. And if you're marinating in, whatever we want to call it, what Wesleyan has called the successor ideology, this kind of mixture of critical race theory and postmodernism and, neo-Marxism and post-structuralism, whatever, that kind of brew of all of those ideas that used to be fringe maybe in the late 60s in the academy, but are now dominant, especially at the more elite schools. What's actually happened is the people that were marinating in those ideas took them into the institutions and are transforming the institutions. And so I don't see this as necessarily a racial issue, although there are parts of it that are. I see this as a just fundamental difference in, let's take the case of journalism, in the role of journalism. So you have a kind of old school group, yes, for sure, more white, more men, who are yes, we are subjective, but we should strive for objectivity. Yes, we may be overwhelmingly liberal. I mean, be almost universally, but we should strive to expose our readers to different viewpoints. Our job is not to be moral arbiters. Our job is to, mirror back the world. Now you have this rising crop of journalists who I would say are not dominant in numbers at the New York Times, but certainly dominant in terms of their passion and their ability to sort of sway the power inside the Times to their position, is no, that's really not what journalism is about. We have more of a moral obligation than those other people think. We're not meant to be neutral. We're meant to bring, what Wesley Lowery has famously called moral clarity to the work that we do. And I think he's been the kind of most prominent proponent of that viewpoint, and people should go read it. The problem with that is, who's determining moral clarity, right? There's an obvious problem, and Jonathan Haidt has written about this in a great paper recently when it comes to higher education. You cannot be both a sort of factory for social justice, and I'm not saying that in a glib way, I mean that in a genuine way, and also have your mission be the pursuit of truth. Those things are at odds. Sometimes the truth does not promote social justice. And so I think that is the fundamental conflict that we're seeing in so many of these institutions. What is the mission of the place? And I think the pain point for a lot of people when it comes specifically to the Times is the New York Times branding is that, the truth is hard. And, we're of no fear or favor. We're all the news that's fit to print. But the gap between what it claims to be and what it's actually become is more and more hard to ignore.
Well, sorry to cut you off, John. Stepping back from the Times a little bit, Bari, why do you think that social justice ideology over the past 5, 10, 15 years has evolved from a focus on structural racism and shining a light on dynamics that for a long time most people weren't aware of, for introducing the concept of white privilege to what some would argue is a more extreme form of censoriousness and deplatforming? Why do you think that trend has intensified so much?
Because people like power. I think it's very basic. It works. It really, really, it's sad to me that it works, but that kind of censoriousness or, making people scared that you're going to cancel them if you say the wrong thing, that accrues a lot of power to your side. And the speed at which major institutions have fallen in line with this, to see, just as a tiny example, Coca-Cola's HR, did you guys see this from last week?
No, I think I missed it.
There was a whistleblower in Coca-Cola where the D&I initiative inside the company was can I pull it up?
Yeah, go for it.
I just don't want to get it wrong. And it was pretty wild. It's just a powerful example. Give me 1 second.
We can do our research in real time. It's fine.
Yeah, sorry. You can edit this part out.
That's fine.
Right. So where Coca-Cola had a training where it's telling people so there was an online training where it was telling people to be less white. Now, there's going to be a lawsuit at Coca-Cola over this, for sure. The question is, can you imagine, you can't have a training inside a corporation telling people to be less of their immutable characteristic. It's racist and wrong. The question is, how did a, multinational, extremely powerful company like Coca-Cola come to do that? That is the really, really, really interesting question to me. So how did it go from what you're describing, which is Ciaran, which is good, let's say good faith read, good intentions, to this kind of censoriousness, or I would argue also reifying race and forcing people to see themselves through a racialized lens, even children, I think is not good. And I would look forward to, I'm sure, the cottage industry of books, if they're allowed to be published, that will be written about it. I certainly think, and I'm obviously the 700th person to make this observation, that there is a direct correlation between the erosion, almost the disappearance of mitigating social institutions that kept us together, like church, like synagogues, like mosques, like civic organizations, and everything that Robert Putnam writes about, and the almost religious adherence to this ideology. I think, to give people the benefit of the doubt, people are desperate for meaning in this country, and they're desperate not to feel alone. And I don't think people are drawn to this ideology because they're bad. I think they're drawn to this ideology because they want meaning and they want to be good. And this gives them a very, very clear pathway to doing that.
So I am, just for full disclosure, I'm a contributor to a project called 1776 Unites, which is in place in large part to sort of tell an uplifting kind of aspirational or optimistic story about the American identity, in part sort of in response to the narrative that came through in the 1619 Project. particularly as it pertains to the Black experience in America. But I thought of 1619 because you made the point a moment ago, sort of remarking on just the terribly sort of damaging impact you would think it would have in the workplace and elsewhere to essentially penalize people for their immutable characteristics, right? Asking people to be less white in the context of Coca-Cola here.
And it goes without saying, obviously, to like tell people as companies did in another time, be less Black. I mean, that was a common thing.
Right. Well,
it's
yeah. So it's an interesting thing because there is an intellectual argument that is being made coming from folks like Ibram Kendi and others. But that also, I think, sort of flows through the pen of Nicole Hannah-Jones and other folks active in the 1619 Project, which an aspect of which, at least, I think has to be kind of reckoned with, even if one doesn't accept the conclusion. And that's this idea that it's important to name race because the social circumstances within which we exist in the United States of America are so tightly bound to our racial identity, even if race itself is a fiction, right? And I think as an aside, it's important to note that Nicole Hannah-Jones and Ibram Kendi and Ta-Nehisi Coates and so forth would all say that race is not something that's literally real, but as a social construct, it is so determinative of where we are as a society that you have to name it, right? And so that frames sort of the story that 1619 tells about what America is as a country and frames the sort of approach to social justice and so forth in that telling. Do you take issue with there being sort of a deep focus on social justice in terms of the editorial focus of the New York Times and projects like 1619 Project and others? Are you drawing a firm distinction between focuses on social justice on the one hand and the sorts of practices that you're identifying at Coca-Cola and elsewhere on the other?
It's a great question. Look, I would say that I had never heard of 1619 as an important date in American history before this project. I'm actually curious. Had you guys?
Yes, as sort of the date at which slavery essentially commences in the New World. Although maybe that's in part just in being African American. This is kind of a date that, for some of us at least, kind of flows down through the telling. But I'm well aware that most people were not.
I wasn't, and to I think that the idea of naming that date and not just putting it on people's radars, but committing an enormous amount of New York Times resources and energy to that project. Sorry, my doorbell just rang. So you're about to hear like my crazy lesbian separatist dogs who are scared of men and delivery men specifically.
That's okay. But we welcome the lesbian separatist dog to the podcast anytime. It's totally fine.
I would say that, like, putting that as a date and making millions of Americans conscious of that date and of the impact that slavery has had on our country and of the contribution that Black Americans have had toward, demanding the freedom that the founding documents demanded, in theory, but making them real. Like that, I absolutely admire and I think is fantastic. What I reject is the idea that was built into the project, and this is where I think it took it too far, that 1776 is not our country's true birth date, and that is a lie, and that this is our country's real birthday, and that I think that undermines. I think that that's wrong. And I think that the way that I think about it is that I think that there's a kind of fundamental tension right now between, I'm looking at, braver angels, but I'm thinking better angels, between a vision of America kind of at its best as a kind of like the nation of immigrants vision of America, which says, none of us were born here, including the founders, including the people that came on the boat in 1619. And everyone is as entitled to the documents that were penned in 1776 as anyone else, like that is a fundamentally optimistic vision. I think the vision of America as, you know, founded in 1619 is sort of fundamentally pessimistic in a way. And I think the politics that seems to grow out of that is one that is a kind of zero-sum identity politics vision that leads us to a very bad place. But tell me if you think that that's unfair or wrong.
Well, I mean, if you're throwing the question back at me, I guess my quick answer to that is to say that I do think that there's some legitimacy in the view that says that colorblindness can be taken to the point of...
Pause. I have to get the door because they've now rung 4 times. Give me
Okay,
one.
go ahead. I was gonna...
I think you should articulate a strong... I think a lot of times you have white people who have not, frankly, studied Black history, like pointing to that MLK quote about, you know, judge man by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And I think a lot of 1619 folks would say that that's a way to dismiss the very real history that is baked into this country. I mean, if you think about
that's kind of exactly where I was going, actually.
Yeah, and I think you should do that because, you know, the Civil Rights Act was only passed in 1965.
Yeah, right.
And
this is so sweet. So it's a Jewish holiday called Purim, and these little kids just dropped off all these treats for me.
Oh, okay. That's nice.
Sorry, let's get back into where we were.
Yeah, I've celebrated Purim. We used to be at a Messianic synagogue. I think I told you that.
Abigail's all this stuff for Purim, Mishloach Manot.
Oh, is she the flower?
No, but look at what it says on the back. Okay, I'm so sorry. Let's get back into it.
You know, I'm perfectly happy to keep all this in, by the way. It's the candid stuff that people really want to see. Barry. No, it's okay. You asked me the question.
I was asking, do you think that assessment of mine is fair or unfair?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what it brings to mind for me is, well, I guess my quick response is just to say that I think there's legitimacy to the view which says that history is so tightly bound to race and identity that while race and identity is not determinative, in my view at least, of every element of your own individual outcome in life, it's worth remembering that just sort of, for instance, the Civil Rights Act having been passed in 1985, Dr. King having died in 1968, and integration having unfolded in a way that allowed opportunity to extend itself to, you know, some millions of African Americans doesn't obscure the fact that a contracting landscape of economic opportunity, both through insourcing of competition in the agricultural and the service sectors and the outsourcing of middle-class jobs through manufacturing to China and so forth, and the layering on top of that of the importation of crack cocaine, the sort of burgeoning of an underground kind of Black market in the absence of legitimate pathways to social mobility, which invited a vicious sort of, or at least an intense and broad-based police response that led to mass incarceration. The gains of the civil rights movement for some folks doesn't obscure all of those other systemic problems for many others. But I think that for myself, and so there's a story, what I'm saying there is that there's a story there to be told. And the criticism of colorblindness that you sometimes get is that we can be blind to some of those realities that travel with racial identity. Right. And there are other things to be said about it. But
John, can I jump in on this one too? Go ahead, Barry.
As the white guy on the call. Yeah.
I think.
Well, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Ciaran, go ahead.
The white guy, but also the resident lefty. I think sometimes.
And the mustachio.
I know. My brother and I are having a competition.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. I think sometimes liberals' allergy to the argument put forward by 1776 is that seeming to deny the centrality of race and slavery and racial subjugation to not only the founding of the country, but also the fabric of the country, sort of flies in the face of history. I mean, even if you look at just time frame and scale, slavery was over 200 years. There was a brief period of Reconstruction. Jim Crow was decades and decades. And even after the nonviolent movement, the Civil Rights Act, you had decades of systemic racism that continue through prisons and voter suppression and all sorts of ongoing systems. And so while I do think it's important to keep in mind the aspirational and universal values on which this country was founded, I think it's sort of impossible to disentangle them from the institution of slavery. And for me, I think that was the core argument of 1619. I think sometimes people get caught up in the symbolism. You know, it's sort of provocative to say, no, this was the true start date of the country. And I think that sticks in people's craw. And I think there were potentially a couple of, sentences in the project that a lot of historians said were, this is actually inaccurate. And I think that gave grist to a lot of the critics. But I think there is a fundamental tension between those two visions. I do think they can be reconciled. I think you can acknowledge and accept and honor that difference and still look to the better angels of our nature, which I think, frankly, was sort of key to Obama's narrative. And I think something that Obama sought to do. John, does that square with how you look at things? Because I know you are an advisor to 1776, which has been positioned in the public imagination as sort of like the opposition to 1619.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying in terms of kind of linking that, the admission of historical inequity on the one hand to a sort of vision of what we want to be as a nation and identifying that as the focus of Obama's. I mean, all of that is true to the way I look at things. And that's why what I was going to sort of wrap that up by saying, Barry, is that ultimately I do sort of come back around to where you began your comments in this podcast, which I think is to say that you're a person, obviously your Jewish heritage informs who you are. There's a history, obviously, for Jewish people in America, just as much as some other groups of persecution, of oppression. You experienced episodes of racism in your life. You told us some quick stories, and more recently, obviously, the Tree of Life Synagogue and what followed from that represented its own kind of distinct downturn, I think, in so many ways. Nevertheless, you said that you always felt yourself to be authentically American and a part of the American story, that you never felt yourself to be out of place in the overarching story that we tell about what America is meant to be, because even while the history is real, we have at least a choice, I think, in terms of what we want to emphasize. And what I would like to think is most determinative of how we feel about our country is the nobler aspirations to which we collectively aspire. Now, in my mind, that doesn't delegitimize anything said in the 1619 Project in terms of particular historical claims. But I do think that it's hard to have a country if we can't ultimately tell a story about the country that is uplifting, rooted in those better angels and rooted in those higher aspirations. And the challenge simply becomes telling that aspirational story, holding to those aspirations, believing in it, while not turning a blind eye or a colorblind eye either to the injustices of history or the injustices of the present. So, Barry, I mean, I think that's how I would sort of respond to the points made.
That's so well put. I guess I would simply say that, I see two dominant narratives out there. One is a vision that basically says, I'm not trying to straw man it. I'm just, realizing that we've been talking for a long time and I'm trying to summarize it on one foot.
For sure.
That says that America is, was built on white supremacy, remains white supremacist, is still deeply racist, and that, the sort of not the remedy, but it's essential to focus on those horrible warts and to sort of focus, I would say, on looking at ourselves and others through a very racialized lens. Mm-hmm. And that is what, that is the only way that we can sort of repair the brutality of American history. Mm-hmm. And there's another vision that says, yes, America's founders were moral hypocrites. Yes, America has a history of systemic racism. Yes, this country was, to a large extent, built by slaves. And all of that is a stain on who we are. Also, we have made incredible progress in this country. Also, we are not where we were, 100 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. And perhaps the best way forward for us is not to obsess on skin color, but to find a way to forge a kind of common culture and a common narrative. And that's the argument that I see people like, Thomas Chatterton Williams, dear friend of mine, making. That's the argument that I see someone like Coleman Hughes making. And fundamentally, I think that is the argument that actually will lead to greater progress. So I guess what I'm reacting to is maybe not the actual 1619 project, a lot of which I think was admirable. What I'm reacting to is a kind of, in my view, dead end, nihilistic, exclusionary identity politics that I don't think will take us to a better place.
Well, not to engage in whataboutism, but simply to ask you about something that I'm not sure how often you're asked this, although maybe it's frequent, and to kind of balance out the conversation here. Everything we've been talking about up until this point has been sort of, criticisms of the institutional media, which I think it's generally accepted is very left-leaning, even before this sort of, recent generation of journalists and so forth that we're talking about a little bit here. Rush Limbaugh just recently passed away, right?
That is not where I thought you were going.
Well, it's where I'm going. I thought I'd take you by surprise. Rush Limbaugh recently passed, and I say this very sincerely. Rush Limbaugh in the early 90s, my grandfather, you probably don't know, my grandfather was a pioneer in radio. He was a white man, but he was instrumental in helping launch the first radio show in America, broadcast rhythm and blues and gospel music. Fats Domino was a great fan of my grandfather's, in part because he helped launch Fats's career. Little Richard, very much a friend, admirer of my grandfather's, etc. Rush Limbaugh did a segment on Grandpa back in the early 90s, sort of lionizing his work and so forth. So I have a little bit of a family fondness in as much as Limbaugh paid tribute to my grandfather's legacy, all that. And I like to be respectful of people when they pass, because we're all human beings. And Rush Limbaugh, as most conservatives will tell you, sort of opened up a space for conservative cultural and political commentary in America that did not exist before him, and gave voice to Americans who generally felt that even in the golden era of Walter Cronkite, et cetera, were not heard, in the media sort of universe. Having said that, when you talk about media dividing the American people, and when you talk about, the media acting in ways so as to keep us from being able to unite over a mutually sort of uplifting narrative, you'd have a lot of folks who would say that Fox News, talk radio, the right-wing ecosystem is at least as guilty of this, if not far more so, than anybody you're going to point to at the New York Times. Now, I'm not saying yes or no to that, but I do want to put the question to you. Is it possible to focus in a lopsided way on the excesses at the Times and in the mainstream establishments without sort of giving due observation to the polarization that may come from the right?
You are not going to get any argument from me about, the role that Fox or Rush or a lot of these people have played in stoking, it's beyond polarization, like the demonization of other Americans, and to some extent bigotry. Don't argue with that for a single second. That's not my world, though, right? So, the reason that I talk often about the things that I'm talking about is there's a lot of other people inside liberal institutions that are shining a light, more than a light, floodlights on that problem. I also think it's a question of where power really lies. And I think that's a very interesting conversation to have. I really think that the elite institutions in the country shape the country much more so than, let's say, Milo Yiannopoulos or he's been out of the game for a while, Charlie Kirk, whoever on the right. And that also, I think, is, I mean, going back to what we were saying about the inordinate focus in CNN on QAnon, like, do I think QAnon is terrible? Do I think it's very disturbing that we have a congresswoman that believes in Jewish space lasers and, frazzle dazzle or whatever that other thing was, and lizard Illuminati? Probably. Of course I do. Like, obviously, yes, I do. But I'm not sure that true political power in this country lies with QAnon. I think it might lie more with, the people that are running Amazon and Twitter and Facebook. And so I tend to be more interested in the ideas, maybe they're not as outlandish, but in the things that those people believe and what they're propagating through these massive institutions. That's a judgment call, though, but that is what I think.
I agree with that. And I also think that it's not just Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, you had, I think, a significant majority of the House Republican caucus vote to overturn the election after the January 6th riots. And you have one political party in the country that you can make an argument embraces anti-democratic impulses, even if they think they're defending democracy, which is actually an interesting dynamic we're going to get into in our debate next week. And so I take your point that
this debate on voter fraud.
Yes.
The
debate, you will be interested in this. So the framing of the debate is voter fraud a major issue, but it's also going to give a lot of conservatives, obviously the 70% of Republicans polls say believe the election was not fair and legitimate, a chance to make their case. And this has pissed off a lot of our liberal members who have written in to say, how can you even hold a debate on this topic? You're giving a platform to disinformation. So I'm actually curious what your view on that is, because at the extreme end of things, I do think deplatforming can help improve discourse. I think the most logical example is Twitter banning Trump, I think has been good for public discourse generally. However, Trump, in my view, was somebody who was constantly acting in bad faith. What we're doing is different. We're giving ordinary citizens an opportunity to make their voice heard. It's very possible that a lot of folks will be articulating conspiracy theories. However, tens of millions of people believe those conspiracy theories.
I think this is such a good question. And listen, I'll give you my rule of thumb. I basically think that it is generally good to moot ideas, even dangerous ideas, in a contained, healthy, I'm not using the word mainstream isn't the right word, but like in a responsible way, because the alternate, like it's very clear where those people go otherwise, and it's to much, much darker places. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of examples I could give, but I'd be super curious to either watch that or participate in it. And I think you should maybe do it on Clubhouse.
Right. Well, yeah, no. Ciaran it's top of mind for us because
one other thing, like I also this is a conversation for another time, maybe another debate. I also think the word disinformation has become very, very elastic, where it's like, a year ago, it was disinformation to consider the fact that maybe the coronavirus was leaked from the lab in Wuhan unintentionally.
Right.
That's disinformation. Now that's, increasingly mainstream. Is it disinformation to say like, wow, Jeffrey Epstein, it looks like his business was blackmailing really wealthy people. And isn't it convenient that he hung himself in a prison cell when all of the cameras were turned off and the guards were asleep? Like, maybe that's a coincidence, but I don't think that it's necessarily disinformation to consider that. By that same light, let's not forget that, I forget if it was the WHO or the CDC, was advising us in the beginning of the pandemic not to wear masks. Like, is that disinformation? Like, so it's very, very hard. I think like there's certain obvious cases. David Icke saying that the Jews are the lizard Illuminati, like, okay, like I don't think I'm the lizard Illuminati or that I have horns. So like that's an obvious case. But I think that that is a term that's getting weaponized more and more by people to shut down, I think, conversations that are maybe hot but should be had. So I don't know. I think that that sounds like a really worthwhile conversation, because, you know, I'll just say, like, I'll give you a good example. When it comes to voter fraud specifically, I think being able to talk about, like, yeah, there is voter fraud in American elections, and acknowledge that is important, because I have heard people that are like, hold on, the mainstream media is pretending that there is no voter fraud. They're saying that it's a conspiracy theory to even talk about voter fraud. And then a week later, they're saying to me, did you read about how Dominion software is controlled by China, which is really controlled by Mark Zuckerberg, which is really controlled by George Soros? And I'm like, holy shit, like, how did you get there? And I think that, again, like being able to to have as wide a debate as possible inside the mainstream is very, very important to capture people that would otherwise go to very dark places on the internet and otherwise.
Yeah. And I think that that's where we have come down at Braver Angels. I mean, and as Ciaran mentioned, you know, there's certainly a conversation to be had about, you know, should Donald Trump have been deplatformed? And I'm going to imagine that many of the folks, many of our members and listeners will say absolutely he should have been, and many other folks will say absolutely he should not have been, including some folks who probably did not vote for the president, but who are concerned about the idea that, and you know, Matt Taibbi said words to this effect when he was here with us recently, that no tech, you know, company should have that kind of power, even over presumably the most powerful person in the free world, the president of the United States. What kind of oligarchical system do we live in within which that might be true? So, you know, but without trying to proffer an easy answer to that particular question on the subject of the American people themselves and our ability to be able to engage in a dialogue that can lead us to a greater shared understanding of what is true, while also strengthening our ability to relate to each other and interact with each other as human beings, so that democracy might survive. We've sort of invested in the idea that, without suggesting that all points of view are equally accurate, all Americans, certainly in a spirit of good faith, have an equal right and an equal need to be heard in making their points about what it is they believe, so that that conversation can move forward in a democracy building sort of way. But we'll see. I hope that you do tune in and watch the debate. One thing we wanted to talk about in our final minutes, Bari, connects right to that, which is this question of how, therefore, do we move forward, given the complexity of everything we've talked about, given the problems that you've identified in the media structure on the left and also, you know, on the right, for that matter. What are the things that give you hope, or what are the vehicles that you see active today that point a path forward towards an America that can transcend its polarization and reestablish some deeper trust between the broken halves of our American marriage?
That's a very beautiful way of putting it. I'll say a few things. I think, like many people, I am nostalgic for the institutions that dominated the 20th century. The newspaper that everyone reads and believes, you know, even think about like Walter Cronkite, like that was the way that it was and people believed it. I don't think we can go back in time. And I think we kind of need to get over the nostalgia for the collapse of many of those institutions, and think about ones that we can build anew. And I have to say, like, the flourishing of independent media right now, the fact that some of, in my mind, the most interesting thinkers and journalists are out there connecting directly to their listeners and audiences through things like podcasts and newsletters, I think that's amazing. We were talking about Clubhouse before. The fact that I can get on Clubhouse and have, you know, a totally freewheeling conversation with thousands of other American, or not even Americans, people all over the world about any topic. Like, I dropped in on a conversation the other night that was happening between Patty Stanger, the millionaire matchmaker, and Damon John about, like, advice for, type A women to like find a man, like things that I never would thought that I could listen to, ranging to, super serious highbrow stuff. Like, I think that that's really, really exciting. I think it's uncertain and I think feels a little shaky. Like we don't have solid ground right now because the old world has kind of collapsed, but the new world hasn't yet been built. Like, I think we're in that liminal in-between space. And that feels, I think, very disorienting and confusing for a lot of people. I think what's going to happen over our lifetimes, they might not look like the old publishing house or the old university or the old newspaper. They might look really different. But I think that's what's going to be, like, I think we're in an age of a kind of great building. And I think that's really, I'm personally very excited to be a part of it. And the fact that you mentioned Matt Taibbi, but I would also mention Glenn Greenwald and a number of other journalists who I've really disagreed with on any number of issues. Mm-hmm. I think we are finding ourselves in a moment of a very interesting political realignment where we are in tremendous and passionate agreement on I think what is one of the critical issues of our time, which is the ability to have those unfettered conversations without the censoriousness of the legacy press or big tech. And on, when you reference what Taibbi said before about the president and Twitter, and the power of these companies, I'm in total agreement on that. And I think that that is going to be a really fruitful and interesting conversation. I don't know, there's so much else I could say. But I pretty much am always on the side of, unfettered conversations between people that disagree and keeping the list of taboo subjects as short as possible is a very, very good rule of thumb. And doing that, not just, in major ways and on podcasts and on Clubhouse and on big platforms, but doing that in our own life, I think is extraordinarily important. And what I think is very tragic is the number of families that I know that have been torn apart by politics over the past few years is pretty heartbreaking. And I think that, for people listening to this who are not, living public lives, or maybe you're an accountant or a dentist or a lawyer or a doctor, and you're wondering what you can do, I think, taking the model of what an organization like Braver Angels is doing in a national way and doing it on a small scale in your own life, that is a very, very good place to start. Because the most important things in our lives, most important people in our lives are the people probably that live in our own home or are in our own families and our tight-knit friend groups. And I think starting there is just an incredibly important place to start, and don't underestimate the importance of it.
Powerfully said. Ciaran, is there anything you want to say as we move towards the curtain call? I feel like the fire was definitely in this conversation. And
I was just nodding my head so much, Bari, to what you just said. I think people are so addicted to national politics, and there's so much political hobbyism and doom scrolling. And what does give people hope is taking action. And where that starts is with the people who you can actually look at their face and who you love and who you want to maintain and strengthen your relationship with, because you don't want to jettison it. And we're in this precarious time, but I think the roaring 20s are about to start. It's going to get warm in New York City. It's going to be like Times Square after World War II. It's going to be a civic renaissance. I'm feeling very optimistic.
Yeah. And I think technology is amazing. It's incredible that I'm able to talk to you guys through this screen, but there is absolutely no substitute for connecting with people in real life. And personally, I cannot wait to get vaccinated and be able to connect. I mean, to some extent, LA is allowed for that, for being outside. But I think that, I'm rambling. I want to second everything you just said.
There you go. Bari Weiss, thank you so much for being on the Braver Angels podcast. Where can people follow you? What do you want to plug? Go ahead and leave us with whatever you want to leave us with.
So I'm one of those independent journalists who is
formerly of the New York Times, formerly of the New York Times. Don't let people forget, right?
Follow my work on barryweiss.substack.com, where I write regularly, and hoping to launch a podcast soon.
There you go. Well, we'll include links in the description below. And for folks who are interested in the work of Braver Angels, for folks who are interested in the mission, check us out. Go to braverangels.org. Join us as a member. Become a volunteer. Join an alliance in your local community. And like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We are building a house united. Until next time.